I found my wife's phone on the kitchen counter on a Tuesday morning. She'd left it there while she was in the shower, and normally I wouldn't have touched it. I'm not that kind of husband. I never went to her messages, never checked her location, never questioned where she'd been. 22 years of marriage, and I had given her every ounce of trust I had. But the screen lit up with a notification, and I made the mistake of glancing at it. The name on the screen was Derek. Derek was my coworker, a guy I had lunch with sometimes, a guy I had invited to my house for a 4th of July barbecue 3 summers in a row. The message preview said, "Last night was incredible. Your husband has no idea, does he? Total pushover." I stood there in my kitchen, in my socks, holding a coffee mug, reading those words over and over. I didn't pick the phone up. I didn't need to. I had already seen enough. I put my mug down very carefully on the counter so it wouldn't make a sound. I walked to the living room. I sat down in my chair, and I just sat there for probably 15 minutes, completely still, while I heard my wife singing softly to herself in the shower upstairs. Total pushover. I want you to understand something about me. I am a 54-year-old man who has spent his entire adult life doing things the right way. I worked my way up from an entry-level position at a logistics company to regional operations director. I coached my son's Little League team for 6 years. I shoveled my elderly neighbor's driveway every winter without being asked. I am not a man who loses his temper. I am not a man who makes scenes. I am patient, I am methodical, and when something needs to be handled, I handle it correctly. So I did not storm upstairs. I did not confront my wife. I did not call Derek and say a single word. I made a second cup of coffee. I kissed my wife on the cheek when she came downstairs. I told her she looked nice, and I drove to work like it was any other Wednesday. But inside, something had shifted permanently. A gear had turned that was never going back. My wife's name is Carol. We met in college, married at 28, raised 2 kids together. Our son Marcus, who is now 26 and lives in Denver, and our daughter Lily, who is 23 and finishing graduate school in Boston. From the outside, we were the couple that other couples looked at and said, "That's what we want." Dinner parties, anniversary trips, a nice house in a suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina. Carol is a real estate agent. Smart, driven, attractive. Everything I thought I knew about her told me she was a person of integrity. Apparently, I had been wrong. I spent the next 2 days doing nothing but observing. I paid attention to her phone, not sneaking through it, just noticing. How often she checked it, how she angled the screen away from me when she typed, how she laughed at something and then immediately went quiet when I walked into the room. I noticed how she said she was staying late at the office on Thursday, which was something that used to happen maybe once every couple of months and had recently started happening every week. I noticed that whenever Derek's name came up in casual conversation, because we moved in overlapping social circles, she didn't react the way a guilty person might. She was too smooth, too unbothered. She'd been doing this long enough that she had learned to control her face. That told me this wasn't new. On Friday evening, I told my wife I needed to fly to Atlanta for a work thing over the weekend. Completely fabricated. I booked a hotel room I had no intention of staying in, packed a bag, and kissed her goodbye. I drove to a hotel 10 minutes from our house, checked in under my own name, and then I called a private investigator named Raymond, who had been referred to me by a friend of mine who is a divorce attorney named Susan Holt. Susan Holt. Remember that name. She matters later. I had already called Susan on Thursday. I didn't tell Carol. I didn't tell anyone. I sat in my car in a parking garage during my lunch break and explained the situation calmly and clearly, and Susan explained to me exactly what I needed, what I should document, and how the process would work. She told me that North Carolina is a fault-based divorce state, which means that documented adultery has real consequences in court, specifically regarding alimony and asset division. She told me not to confront my wife, not to change my behavior in any way, and to let her and Raymond do their work. The worst thing you can do right now, Susan told me, is tip her off. I asked her how long this would take. She said, give it 30 days, maybe 60. Give it 30 days, maybe 60. Do you have the patience for that? I thought about that message on the phone. Total pushover. I have all the patience in the world, I said. Raymond was a former Charlotte police detective, quiet and professional. The kind of man who spoke in complete sentences and didn't waste your time. I met him at a Panera Bread near my hotel and walked him through everything I knew. He told me his rate, I told him I understood, and we shook hands. I drove back to the hotel and ordered room service and watched a documentary about the Roman Empire and slept better than I had in months. That weekend, while I was supposedly in Atlanta, Raymond confirmed that Derek visited my house on Saturday afternoon and didn't leave until Sunday morning. He had photographs. I went home Sunday evening with a slightly tanned face. I'd sat by the hotel pool for 2 hours specifically so I'd have something to show for my Atlanta trip. And Carol greeted me at the door and asked if the flights had been rough. I told her they were fine. I brought her a box of Godiva chocolates I had actually ordered from a shop in Charlotte because I knew she'd notice if the box was from a gas station. She hugged me and told me I was the sweetest. I smiled and said, "You deserve it." And I meant it as something else entirely. Here's the thing that I want to explain carefully, because it was the part of the story that even the people closest to me had trouble understanding later. Over the next several weeks, I became a better husband, not because I was trying to save the marriage. I had already made my decision the morning I read that message. But because I needed Carol to believe that nothing had changed. I needed her comfortable, unsuspecting, and continuing to meet with Derek on a regular schedule so that Raymond could build a complete and airtight case. So I brought her flowers. I made her favorite dinners. Chicken piccata, that orzo salad she liked from a recipe she'd torn out of a magazine 6 years ago. I suggested we go see a movie, the kind of romantic comedy she loved and I pretended to tolerate. I held her hand in the theater. I told her she looked beautiful. Every single moment of it was deliberate. And the whole time I was meeting with Susan, reviewing documents, organizing finances, having certain joint accounts quietly assessed by a forensic accountant Susan recommended, and going over every detail of what came next. Raymond gave me his full report on day 34. 14 documented instances of Derek at my house or leaving a hotel with my wife over the previous 5 weeks. Timestamps, photographs, license plate records. Everything organized in a manila folder that I kept in a locked drawer in my office at work. Susan looked it over and said it was more than enough. She also told me something important. Derek was up for a major promotion at our company. His name had been circulating for weeks as the leading candidate for VP of Supply Chain Operations. It was a big deal. There was a formal announcement dinner scheduled for the following Friday evening, a private event at a restaurant downtown, with the company president and several board members in attendance. Derek's wife, Linda, would be there. His 2 teenage kids, his parents, who were flying in from Ohio. Susan and I looked at each other across her conference table. "That's your moment," she said. "Yes," I said. "It is. I need to pause here and tell you what was going on inside me during all of this, because I want to be honest. I was not okay. I was functioning. I was more than functioning. I was executing a plan with a level of precision I didn't know I had. But underneath all of it, I was quietly devastated. 22 years. I had loved this woman. I had built a life with her. I had held her hand in the hospital when her mother passed. I had driven 4 hours each way to help her close her first big real estate deal because her car had broken down and she was panicking. I was not a pushover. I was a husband who showed up. And she had looked at that and decided it wasn't enough. And then she had let someone call me a pushover in a text message and apparently not corrected him. That was the part that burned the most, honestly. Not the affair. The contempt. So yes, I was going to that dinner, but I had one more thing to do first. 3 days before the announcement dinner, I told Carol that I had received an invitation to the event and that she should come as my guest. I kept it casual, completely natural, told her it was a company celebration, that a few spouses would be there, that it would be a nice evening out. I didn't mention Derek's name. She said that sounded lovely. I watched her face when she said it. Nothing. Completely composed. She was good. I'll give her that. What Carol didn't know, what I had arranged through a contact in HR, very discreetly, was that I had confirmed Derek had also invited Linda to the dinner. So both couples would be in the same room. Carol would be standing next to me believing I had no idea about anything, while Derek was across the room pretending the same thing. I also hadn't told Carol that Susan Holt would be there. Susan would arrive separately, sit at the bar, and wait. The Friday evening of the dinner, I put on my best suit, charcoal gray, the one Carol had picked out for me 2 Christmases ago. And I helped Carol with the clasp on her necklace and told her she looked stunning, and she kissed me on the cheek and said, "We clean up pretty well, don't we?" "We really do," I said. We drove downtown together, parked in the deck on Tryon Street, walked into the restaurant side by side. The room was already half full when we arrived. Round tables with white linens, soft lighting, the low hum of professional conversation. The company president, Robert Calloway, was near the bar with a drink, laughing with someone from the board. And across the room, in a navy suit, holding a glass of champagne and looking like a man who believed he had everything. Derek. His eyes found mine the second we walked in. And I watched his face go through approximately 4 different expressions in the span of 2 seconds: surprise, confusion, a fast recalibration, and then a smile that was about 40% too wide. "Tom," he said, extending his hand, "didn't know you'd be here." "Wouldn't miss it," I said, and I shook his hand firmly, and I smiled at him the way you smile at someone when you know exactly who they are. Linda was beside him, a pleasant woman, completely innocent in all of this, and I felt genuinely sorry for what was about to change in her life. That was the part of this I didn't feel good about, but she deserved to know. She had been living inside the same lie I had, and that wasn't fair to her either. Carol and Derek made brief, polite eye contact across the table as we all sat, nothing that would register to anyone watching. They were both professionals at this. Dinner proceeded. Salads, entrees, the usual corporate event choreography. I ate well. I drank 1 glass of wine and switched to water. I was pleasant to everyone around me. I laughed at the right moments and asked Robert about his grandchildren because I remembered from a previous conversation that his youngest had just started walking. I was calm in a way I had never felt before in my life. About 40 minutes into dinner, during a lull between the entree and the speeches, I quietly excused myself from the table. I told Carol I was going to the restroom. I walked past the bar, caught Susan's eye, gave her a small nod. She set down her drink and opened her briefcase. I walked back to the table. I did not go to the restroom. I stood at the edge of the room for just a moment, and I felt everything very clearly. The weight of the folder in the inner pocket of my jacket, the quiet of my own breathing, the particular kind of peace that comes from having done every single thing correctly. Then I walked back to the table and sat down. Robert Calloway stood up and tapped his glass. The room went quiet. He began his remarks about the company, about growth, about the qualities of leadership. He said Derek's name. He talked about integrity and dedication. He invited Derek to stand. Derek stood. He was beaming. Linda was clapping beside him. Carol was clapping too. I set my wine glass down. Robert finished his remarks and invited Derek to say a few words. Derek thanked the company, thanked his family, thanked the people in this room who have always believed in him. He looked briefly at Carol when he said that, and then he looked at me. And I held his gaze and smiled, and I reached into my jacket. I stood up. The room wasn't expecting that. A few people looked over. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, and my voice was completely steady, "but I have something that needs to be delivered tonight." I walked over to Carol. She looked up at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something between confusion and the very first edge of fear. I placed the envelope on the table in front of her. Legal-sized, sealed, her full name typed on the front. "Divorce papers," I said quietly, but not so quietly that the people immediately around us couldn't hear, along with documentation that I believe you'll find thorough. I turned and looked at Derek. "There's a copy for you too," I said. "HR will have it Monday morning." Susan appeared at my elbow and handed me a second envelope, which I placed on the table in front of Derek. He did not move. He looked like a man who had just stepped on ice he thought was solid. I picked up my suit jacket from the back of my chair. I straightened my tie. "Robert," I said, nodding to the company president who was standing very still with a champagne glass halfway to his mouth. "Thank you for the dinner. The salmon was excellent." I walked out of the restaurant. I didn't run. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look back. I stood on the sidewalk on Tryon Street on a warm Friday night in Charlotte, and I breathed in the air and I felt, for the first time in 34 days, like myself again. My phone started ringing approximately 90 seconds later. I didn't answer it. I walked 2 blocks to where Susan had arranged a car, and I got in, and I rode to the hotel I had already booked for the evening, and I ordered a steak from room service, and I called my son Marcus in Denver. "Hey, Dad," he said. "What's up?" "I just wanted to hear your voice," I told him. "Everything's fine. I'm good. There are things I learned in the weeks and months that follow that I want to share, because I think they matter." Derek did not receive the promotion. The documentation I had submitted to HR, which included, among other things, evidence that he had used a company credit card on 2 occasions during his time with my wife, was more than enough to disqualify him. His employment was terminated within 10 business days. I don't know what happened between him and Linda. That was their private business, and I kept it that way. Carol hired a lawyer. Of course she did. But Susan had done her homework, and the documented adultery in a false state meant that the terms of the divorce reflected the reality of what had happened. We had a house, retirement accounts, 2 cars, and 22 years of shared finances. Carol walked away with significantly less than she would have under a no-fault filing, which was what she had assumed I would pursue because, as Derek had so helpfully noted, she thought I was a pushover. I kept the house. I had lived there for 16 years. I was not leaving my house. Lily called me the week after it all happened. She had heard from her mother. I told her the full story, calmly, leaving nothing out. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Dad, I'm proud of you." Marcus said something similar. Those were the two moments that hit me harder than anything else in this whole ordeal. Because when your adult children tell you they're proud of you, it means something in a way that is very difficult to describe. I'm not going to tell you this was easy. 34 days of being a loving husband to someone who is deceiving you requires something from you that you don't get back the same way. I slept about 5 hours a night for most of it. I lost 8 pounds. Some mornings I sat in my car in the driveway for 10 minutes before I could make myself go inside. But I want to tell you why I didn't just walk out the day I saw that message. And I want to explain this clearly, because it's the question that I think matters most. I stayed because leaving immediately would have meant a no-fault divorce, in which 22 years of an asset-building marriage would have been split down the middle, and a man who had helped destroy my marriage would have been promoted and celebrated and never faced a single consequence. I stayed because documentation of fault changes everything in North Carolina family court, and I wasn't going to hand Carol and Derek a clean exit when I was the one who had done nothing wrong. That's not weakness. That's not being a pushover. That is understanding how the world actually works and using every tool available to you in the correct sequence. Patience is not the same as passivity. Silence is not the same as acceptance. I knew exactly what I was doing from the moment I set that coffee mug down on the counter. The plan was already forming. The only question was how long I was willing to wait to execute it correctly. The answer was, as long as it took. I have been living alone in my house for about 8 months now. I have repainted the kitchen a color I actually like. I bought a truck I've been thinking about for years but kept putting off. I have dinner with Marcus and Lily on FaceTime most Sundays, and I have driven up to see Lily in Boston twice. And she is doing well and finishing her thesis on urban planning, and she makes me feel like the future is something to look forward to. I am not bitter. I want to be clear about that. Bitterness is a weight that belongs to other people. What I am is free and clear-eyed and done, completely and permanently done, with the version of myself who had it out trust without paying attention to whether it was being honored. If you are sitting somewhere right now feeling like what happened to you is too large to survive, I want to tell you that it is not. The size of what was done to you is not the ceiling on what you are capable of doing next. You are allowed to be quiet. You are allowed to be quiet. You are allowed to take your time. You are allowed to prepare carefully and wait for exactly the right moment. And when that moment comes, you walk in calmly. You say what needs to be said, you place what needs to be placed on the table, and then you straighten your tie and you walk out the door. The salmon at that restaurant really was excellent, by the way. I still think about it sometimes.